So it's funny we're talking about Wayfair this episode, and I think this is perfectly timed because quite literally this morning I bought shampoo on Amazon because I was too lazy to go to Target and get it in person.
So was that stuff that you would have bought already? Or is it like, did you buy it just because you could get it on Amazon?
Definitely because I need it, not just because I could get it on Amazon.
Yes. We wanted to see how many people are like Zoe, right? And are just changing their consumer behavior, but not really their consumption level. Because we hear a lot, well, the counties, local governments, the state got Wayfair. And we wanted to understand what the data said kind of about that claim. And so let's get into it. So welcome to Off the Charts, the Creatures of Statute series where we dig into the data and get to tell the stories that most people and most policymakers don't get to see. I'm Vanessa Fielder, joined by Brandon Nee and Zoe Averill. So today we want to talk about Wayfair, what it is, how we got here, and whether or not consumer behavior has really changed. So let's get into it. So Brandon, I think before we get started, it's probably good for our listeners to not think this episode is about a furniture company. So can you kind of reconnect us with this story and how we got here in the first place?
Yeah, and to bring it kind of full circle to the story Zoe was just telling, in terms of a tax base or taxability, recently it doesn't make much of a difference. So for people that have lived in the economy and sort of the revenue mindset of the last 8 years, doesn't matter whether it was purchased online or purchased at Target, but it hasn't always been that way. So if we go back to 1992, there was a very significant case about taxability, and this predates the internet, but it certainly set the stage for how we then either did or didn't tax things that were purchased on the internet. So we go back to a Quill case. And this was in response to things that were ordered by catalog, so mail orders. And it was determined that we couldn't tax things that didn't have a nexus in a given state. And so the internet doesn't have a nexus. And so from 1992 to 2018, we were not taxing things as the internet started to grow and then boom that were purchased online.
And right, that was it was like a physical nexus, right? So like you had to have a store in a state.
Absolutely. So you had to be Target and have a brick and mortar operation in the state to have your sales be taxed. And so the significant change then is 2018, and you alluded to this furniture company. We have a decision that sort of reverses that outcome in the Wayfair decision. And so now we can apply tax to internet sales as well. And so the modern conversation is very much around whether there's this newfound money in government revenues or whether it is just some either a partial or full recovery of a degraded base. But what's also interesting is this time period from 1992 to 2018. Is there data or is there something that we can look at to sort of set a baseline? Like what was our original baseline or what was the foundation of retail sales? Did that change either behaviorally or from a tax base over time? And then what does that say about what's going on more recently from that 2018 decision forward?
I think the other interesting thing, having lived through the conversation back in 2018 and 2019, was this was a huge coalition effort in order to make this happen in Arizona. And I think really quickly nationwide it happened. But here it took like all of the brick and mortar retailers, negotiation with the online retailers, some of which already had a physical nexus in Arizona and were already taxpayers, along with, taxpayer groups like ATRA, and then all of the local government interests, of which are hugely diverse in this space. Right? You've got rural areas that buy a lot of stuff online, and then you've got urban areas that house a lot of these distribution facilities. So it was a really diverse group of folks that had to all come together and agree on how we were going to establish this economic nexus in Arizona to say, all right, if I buy something from a company that does no other business in Arizona and they just ship me like one $4 thing, do they have to remit taxes? What's the right trade-off for companies in terms of a threshold they need to meet before it's like a burden to interstate commerce? So that was a super interesting part of this conversation.
It was such a foundational change that having lived through it, it was interesting to watch what are normally really divergent sets of stakeholders be almost just as interested as the others in having some solution as opposed to just total chaos.
Yeah, so Brandon, that question that you brought up, looking back at the time period from, 92 to 2018 and establishing sort of a baseline, what does that actually look like?
Yeah, so luckily we have a little bit of data. There's a lot in this space, but we did pull some stuff together so we could kind of see these trends happen. We dug into it a lot back in like 2018, 2019, when we were trying to understand the magnitude of what the Supreme Court's decision was leaving on the table. And so I went back to that same data, which is really just national e-commerce data that the Census Bureau collects. And we're looking here, this orange line is just the share of total retail activity in the United States that comes from e-commerce. And you can see in Quill, like you mentioned, Brandon, I don't think the first transaction had happened on the internet yet. And so by 2000, we had like less than 1% of all retail sales were coming from Amazon or just online purchases in general. eBay was a huge player, right, in the early 2000s.
Yeah, and you look at this chart, fast forward to 2018, e-commerce is now making up almost 10% of all retail sales. That's, a huge jump over a 20-year time period.
And so the analysis that we didn't really get a chance to run last time that we could run this time, because now we have some data on remote sales, was, well, what did Arizona's tax base look like? So I went back to DOR's old reports, of which thankfully the Wonderful Memory Project has archives of, and I was able to pull all of the Arizona retail taxable sales from 1993-ish forward. And then I didn't really have a good way to normalize that over time, right? Because there's way more people here than there were in 1990 buying stuff, and the dollar is worth less now. So I kind of normalized it by taking it as a share of personal income to say, are we taking more of people's income in taxable sales than we were in the early 1990s?
And very clearly, we're taking less.
Yeah, that line's going down.
Yes.
And obviously, like, eagle-eyed viewers will see that a big drop is during the Great Recession.
Yeah.
Totally makes sense. It then basically bottomed out and didn't really change very much. And so now, what are we taking? Just like 20?
A little over 20%.
Yeah. Of all personal income is captured in taxable sales. And that's at the same time that the thing you pointed out, Zoe, that e-commerce is now becoming a much more important part of the retail tax base. And in between those two lines, right, Quill to Wayfair, we couldn't tax it.
So it's just a slow leak, right? We've got the inability to tax online sales, and then we see this share of personal income drop. So these things are really just stacking on top of each other.
And so fast forward then to kind of post Wayfair, and the question really was, all right, did we get back to kind of pre-internet levels? And so we can add on now, the Department of Revenue tracks everything that could be classified as like a remote retail purchase or something that's done through a marketplace facilitator, and kind of everything gets thrown into that bucket. So I stacked it on top of this. But the really important thing for folks to understand is everything gets put into this group. It's not just stuff that is newly taxable after Wayfair. So like Amazon moved and had a distribution facility in Arizona in like 2007.
Yes.
So they started to be subject to some of their sales being taxable back then.
So a lot of the major players we're talking about, that's not just the Amazon experience right here in Arizona, because I know like Walmart, Amazon, a lot of those big online marketplace facilitators that we talk about already had a physical nexus here.
Yeah. So they were being taxed on some of their transactions. And that's kind of the chaos that you had alluded to, Brandon. It was kind of confusing, right? Like if I sell my small business thing through Amazon to someone in Arizona, does Amazon have to collect Arizona TPT? That was the question before Wayfair. And so now it's much more clear. The answer is yes. And so I don't get like a tax break going to an out-of-state retailer to buy my shampoo versus buying from, the local distributor down the road. It's all the same. I pay the same sales tax regardless.
So really the only thing that changed after Wayfair were those, non-household name kind of places, the places that do not have a physical nexus here. They exist either solely online or in a completely different state whatsoever.
Well, clarification for those big marketplace facilitators too.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Just consistency.
But even with that consistency, right, what we can see here is that the kind of share of personal income that's consumed by retail and adding in remote retail is still not approaching those kind of pre-internet levels. So what we can see here is that it's even those two things together, right, the remote sales and the retail sales are not approaching those like early 1990s levels of personal income.
Yeah, it's starting to move you back in the neighborhood, but it's funny your line there almost provides like a trend line to see that you're still off of that time period post 2007.
And that's like with COVID. It was a remarkable time in 2020 and 2021 where you literally couldn't go to the store. So thank goodness we had enacted these changes to be able to make sure that we were still able to avoid leakage from the tax base when you like, couldn't go somewhere.
And it just accelerated that trend that you had before. We didn't follow as much the results through COVID once the Arizona bill changed things. But I remember that shift to about 10% of retail happening online, and COVID just accelerated people's usage. I remember when we had this conversation, it was kind of fun to guess. It was almost generational, right? About like, how much are people using online? And I remember some of it being around Christmas, and it's like, well, I use it Amazon and stuff already a lot, but not everybody thought that it was that prevalent, and COVID just forced even my parents and people who never shopped online to shop online.
Well, it's interesting when we think about that, right? Like in my shampoo case, I'm not buying more shampoo online just because I'm able to buy it online. Right. It's the same amount. Yeah. It's just a different sort of consumer behavior.
Yeah. When we got people used to the convenience, clearly, because it didn't return to people shopping in stores.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? Like this orange line, this national trend of e-commerce as a share of retail has only gotten higher since Wayfair happened. But in Arizona, at least, what we can see is that doesn't necessarily mean more of it's being captured in the tax base. So Zoe, I know you've looked into kind of how our revenues have adjusted as a result kind of this change in how we tax online sales. What does it look like in terms of actual dollars that are coming into the counties?
Well, so if we look at 2025, right, I think in total, the counties stood to benefit from around $122 million in revenues as a result of the ability to tax online sales.
And that's in both our kind of limited general fund local excise tax, right, and our state shared TPT distribution?
Yeah, that's correct. But it's interesting when we look at that revenue compared to one of our biggest cost drivers, ALTCS, right? From 2019 to 2025, just to kind of put it into perspective, the total county contribution for ALTCS grew by $129 million, right? And so we see just from a single cost driver, our contribution to ALTCS more than consuming the revenue that we stood to benefit from Wayfair.
And that's every single year, right?
Exactly.
So like, wow.
And that's just one cost driver.
Yeah.
Doesn't even take into account, other things, salary.
Salary growth since COVID has been pretty dramatic, especially compared to the 10 years before.
We've also seen like employer health insurance costs rise a lot, risk management stuff going through the roof. There's a lot of local costs.
Just general inflation as well. We talk a lot about the construction cost index increasing, an insane amount. Everything is more expensive.
And some of that we can see in the revenue data, but like remote retail has been one of the fastest growing categories. So I'm going to pull up the revenue dashboard, which is beautifully redesigned, by the way. If you haven't checked it out, please do. But we can look at how kind of classifications have changed and across all of the counties that have a general fund sales tax. So we're not talking about Maricopa or Pima or Mojave because they don't have one. But for those counties that do, remote retail sales is like one of the primary drivers of growth right now.
It's interesting when we look at remote retail. That does take up quite a large share of our tax base too.
It does. It's grown a lot faster, right, than I think we would have anticipated. And across these counties, it's 10% of all of the excise tax collections that came in the past month came from remote retail sales. And you can see kind of this trend over the last several years about how this classification has grown relatively rapidly.
Can you go back to the categorical like performance?
Yeah.
Because you're showing information, and we know from year-over-year revenue conversations with the counties that revenues are only growing. But we're seeing a retail number
that's growing 1%.
But that's still like pretty anemic growth for the largest portion of the tax base.
Yeah, and really you're kind of thinking about those together, like retail and remote retail.
Yes.
And so there's a conversation about growth, but also just shift still happening, right? So we're stealing from a category as we also build this growth inside remote retail sales.
But again, kind of suggesting that this isn't like new taxable activity,
Right.
because if people were still buying the same stuff in brick and mortar stores and traditional retail, we'd be seeing regular retail continue to grow at a relatively rapid pace, but we're not seeing that. It's basically flat from last year.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not as transformative as the narrative seems to make it out to be, right? We're just slowing that leak from that time period where we weren't able to capture the same amount of revenue.
Yeah. And it's certainly complicated, right? Like, we hadn't gotten this revenue for 20 years since the Quill decision, but I think we've seen the effects of kind of that degrading tax base on things like the property tax, where we're just kind of getting extra pressure when we don't see that broad base on the sales tax side on our other revenue categories.
Yeah, the timing was also fortunate from your first chart. We were talking about what we were missing before, luckily, was happening before internet sales rose above 10% of total retail.
Yes.
What we've seen since would have become an exponential problem.
Yeah, I can't imagine what would have happened to kind of local government's ability to provide services during COVID had remote sales not been taxable. And Zoe, that speaks to your point about how this wasn't really a transformational change. It was really just recapturing consumer behavior shifts. And even with that, those revenues have all been consumed by like one single cost driver. So most of this data that we went through today is available on our website at countysupervisors.org/data. And so dig into it, see kind of how important remote retail sales is to your county, and we'll see you next time on Off the Charts.